Professor Sachs, can you put on your video?
Oh, I thought it was on, sorry. My video is on.
All right. Welcome and good morning, everybody, to the launch of the 2021 edition of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific. This year's theme is towards post-COVID-19 resilient economies. And with us today, we have four terrific speakers that we hope you find interesting. First, we have the Executive Secretary of ESCAP and Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Ms. Armida Sasia Alas-Jabana. And then for our keynote address this morning, we're very honored to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He is also president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Following Professor Sachs, we have Mr. Hamza Malik. He is the director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division here at ESCAP. And last but not least, of course, we have Ms. Sweta Saxena. She's chief of the Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis section at MPFD. So without, we have just 1 hour for our event today, and we want to make sure we have enough time to hear everybody, as well as get to some questions at the end. So without any further ado, let me give the floor over to the Executive Secretary, Ms. Armida Sasia Alas-Jabana. Madam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Dear Professor Jeffrey Sachs, participants, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a truly challenging year for policymakers in the Asia-Pacific region. The COVID-19 pandemic caused unprecedented socio-economic disruptions to all, reversing hard-earned development gains by years, if not decades. We estimate that 89 million more people in the region have been pushed back by the pandemic into extreme income poverty. I'm pleased to note that member states in Asia and the Pacific have taken bold and solutions-oriented policy measures to minimize the pandemic's social and economic damage, including unprecedented fiscal and monetary support. Last year, developing countries in the region announced some $1.8 trillion, or nearly 7% of their combined GDP, in COVID-19 related budgetary support. However, the scale of such policy measures remains limited compared to the challenge in front of us. Our analysis shows that progress towards recovery has been highly uneven to date. Fully healing the deep scars of COVID-19 pandemic on human well-being and sustainable development is likely to be a time-consuming process. If history is any guide to navigating current and future challenges, Survey 2021 finds that adverse shocks, such as the Asian financial crisis, Indian Ocean tsunami, and SARS, resulted in permanent economic, social, and environmental losses. But the region's own experience with crisis also illustrates the important role of policies in mitigating those shocks and facilitating recovery. The survey asks an important policy question. How can Asia-Pacific region recover better together? In other words, how can post-pandemic development be more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable? The survey proposes an illustrative policy package that aims to provide access to social services by all, close the digital divide, and strengthen climate actions. This means that when the next shocks strike, all people would have access to healthcare services, the poor and vulnerable population groups promptly receive financial aid, and all workers and students, including in remote areas, have stable access to the internet. From the environmental perspective, this policy package entails spending to promote energy access and efficiency, climate-resilient infrastructure, and biodiversity. Our estimates show that such a package could help reduce the number of poor people in the region by almost 180 million and cut carbon emissions by about 30% in the long run. Ambitious and targeted policy measures are needed to ensure that recovery is robust and inclusive. and that a more resilient and sustainable future emerges from the crisis. However, public debt sustainability in some developing Asia-Pacific countries could be at risk while delivering such a package. For example, emerging economies such as China, India, and the Russian Federation are major creditors for least developed countries in the region. The success of debt relief effort, such as debt service suspensions and debt swaps, depends crucially on goodwill and cooperation within this region. At the global level, Secretary General Guterres has underlined the need to reform the international debt architecture. At the regional level, there are also other areas that emerging Asia-Pacific economies can do to help the countries with special needs, including the least developed countries. For instance, Lao PDR has raised over $2 billion from issuing public bonds in Thailand. Other small economies could explore this option. Similarly, India and the Russian Federation are hosting many migrant workers from the region. Governments in origin economies can consider issuing diaspora bonds in these destination economies. More broadly, assets held by pension funds and sovereign wealth funds in emerging Asia-Pacific economies are huge, but their investment barely contribute to sustainable development in the countries with special needs. Relaxing investment rules that govern these funds can be an important step forward. In this regard, I call on governments to show a spirit of multilateralism. To conclude, COVID-19 has been a pandemic like no other. Yet it offers a unique opportunity for governments and other stakeholders to chart a new path to rebuilding. Whilst being forced to adjust, the Asia-Pacific region has seen fundamental transformation in lives and livelihoods. It is high time that the region takes its lessons from this pandemic and commits to a foundation that ensures an enhanced ability to withstand future pandemic-induced crises to the system without its people and the planet having to again pay a high price. The 2021 Economic and Social Survey is a timely publication that takes us through the immediate socio-economic challenges, historical lessons, and future options for building towards post-COVID-19 resilient economies in the Asia-Pacific region. I hope you will find it to be a valuable contribution to our knowledge on this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Executive Secretary. It's my pleasure and honor now to give the floor to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his keynote address. Professor Sachs.
Thank you so much. What a great honor to be with the ESCAP on the launch of this year's Economic and Social Survey. Thank you, Executive Director, for your leadership and for your important statement. And thanks to ESCAP for taking such good care of a very large part of the world. Within ESCAP, as everybody knows, there are 4.6 billion people, 60% of all of the people on the planet. The ESCAP region really is the center of gravity for the world society and world economy. And what happens in ESCAP will not only shape the lives and the fates of more than half the world's population, but will fundamentally shape the entire world's trajectory. So it's so important that countries in the ESCAP region not only recover better from this disaster, but also fundamentally and finally bring the pandemic under complete control. Indeed, the title of this year's report is Towards a Post-COVID Resilient Economies in the Region. And I want to take that challenge in two steps. First, to get to post-COVID, because we still have a very dangerous and in some places raging pandemic. So to get to post-COVID recovery and resilience, we need to end the COVID pandemic. I want to say a few words about that, and then I would like to speak to the growth and development phase that I believe will follow this pandemic and in which the ESCAP region will play such a fundamental role. What is remarkable about this pandemic is how uneven the impacts and even the dynamics of the pandemic itself have been. And within ESCAP, there is a very significant fraction of countries, especially in the East Asia and Pacific region, that have performed the best in the world in stopping the community transmission of the virus. I want to commend China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos PDR, Thailand, and other countries of the region that have outperformed all of the rest of the world in stopping the ongoing transmission and thereby in saving massive numbers of lives. If I compare, for example, the United States and our experience in the pandemic with that of the East Asia Pacific region, the United States has had, as of today, 550,000 deaths. In China, the deaths have been fewer than 5,000. And that ratio of roughly 100 to 1, or in per capita terms, a gap of more than 400 to 1 higher mortality in the US and Western Europe than in the Asia Pacific region is a remarkable accomplishment, but I believe also a guideline for all of the rest of the ESCAP region still battling with rapid transmission, and indeed for all the rest of the world. What these successful economies have shown is that it's possible to stop the transmission of the virus through rigorous measures of testing, tracing, contact tracing, quarantining, and acting quickly to pounce on each outbreak when it occurs to bring it under control through public health means. And the populations in those countries have been heroic in following public health guidelines, in respecting physical distancing and wearing face masks, in cooperating and participating in self-isolation when necessary, in taking, in short, the steps that are needed by society and government together to bring the pandemic under control. Now, this was accomplished even before vaccines started to be introduced. Now we have another powerful tool for saving lives and for breaking transmission. And soon, according to some positive but still partial evidence, we may have effective therapeutic drugs within the next few months as well to add to the armamentarium for stopping this disease. My belief is that if we are organized, if we are cooperative globally, if we massively scale up the production of vaccines made by China, by Russia, by Europe, the United States, and other countries, and use every production facility we can mobilize, and if we follow the good lessons of the successful countries, we can end this pandemic by the end of 2022. Now, that may still seem a long way off because we will have transmission and challenges definitely for another year ahead and really for 1.5 to 2 years. But we can win this battle even within a much shorter period of time. We can make decisive progress to stop the suffering and deaths substantially. And if we do this, we will speed the economic recovery, but most importantly, we will speed the recovery to good lives and to saving lives of people in all parts of the world. The avoidable deaths are a tragedy, and we have to reinforce our efforts to end this pandemic. Now, I believe that we will accomplish this because we're learning and we're seeing the results of success, and we have the means and the technologies now to cooperate if we have the intelligence and will to do so. We need, therefore, also to do what this report bids us to do and wisely bids us to do, and that is to prepare for a strong and resilient recovery alongside the remaining steps to end the pandemic. And here, I think it is clear that the recovery that we need and that we want must be an investment-led recovery. That is the investment in sustainable development. That is the investment in achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity to stop the destruction of biodiversity and habitats around the world. This requires smart investments in three basic areas. Most importantly, in education of all of us, but especially young people. We must get children back into school, and we must ensure that they have a quality education and are able to reach their potential, completing universally secondary education as called for by SDG 4, but going on to advanced education as well. And here I want to emphasize that digital connectivity can mean a fundamental breakthrough in reaching children everywhere to enable either blended or online education of a quality that could not be achieved before a digital reach. So the first investment we must make is in the health and education of our children all through the ESCAP region. The second investment we must make is in technological upgrading and transformation for a green, digital, and sustainable recovery and growth. Digital is clear. We will be in a period in which all parts of economic life go online, in which every sector of the economy depends on universal digital access, and in which digital technologies, artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, remote sensing, and other technologies enabled by the digital revolution will play a fundamental role in raising productivity and in ensuring competitiveness of economies. The second part of the technological transformation we need is the green transformation. It's clear that as soon as we overcome the COVID shock, we're going to be facing for years and decades ahead the climate shock. This is already upon us. Every day, every week, every month, and every year, we're going to have climate challenges all over the world until we make the decisive steps to reach net zero emissions and climate neutrality, and to do that by mid-century. The good news is that, as with the digital revolution, we have a revolution in clean energy and in clean energy technologies underway, which is going to enable us to move forward faster, more deeply, and more decisively than we would have imagined even a few years ago. In ESCAP, every one of the countries has national renewable energy resources, whether it's wind or sunshine or hydropower or geothermal energy or at least some sustainable biomass energy. There are vast reservoirs of renewable energy that can be tapped, and setting pathways of investment so that all of the region is able to move to a clean, green, zero emission society and economy by mid-century will be a basic part of the recovery. And the third technological dimension that I want to stress is sustainable, highly productive precision agriculture, because we need to upgrade land use, forestry, agriculture, and fisheries with advanced technologies as well to ensure the production that we need together with the environmental sustainability that is essential. So this second category of investment, technological transformation and upgrading to digital, green, and sustainable technologies, will be a fundamental part of the economic strategies of all of the ESCAP region and all of the world. The third investment that we need is in business. Businesses for employment, businesses to scale up production, businesses to provide the new goods and services in the green and digital economy. Fortunately, ESCAP is a region that has an underlying impulse of business investment and the potential through regional cooperation for a massive development of new, green, and sustainable businesses and millions of new jobs created thereby. Now, what will be needed to achieve this positive vision? Just as with ending the pandemic, the most important need for our success in sustainable development is actually political. It is cooperation, first among neighboring countries, then within the broader region, and then between regions of the world at a global scale. Let me say just a word about each of these scales of cooperation. It is the most basic point of sustainable development that neighboring countries must cooperate with each other, because neighbors share riversheds, neighbors share climate risks, neighbors must share intermittent renewable energy on grids that transmit power across national boundaries. This should, in a good world, be a natural phenomenon that you get along with your neighbor. But we know in the real world, we have so many local conflicts where neighbors are actually even opposing each other across barbed wire divides with hostility and with the even risk of outright conflict. And I would say that success in sustainable development requires more than anything that we overcome and rethink those historical legacies and those ongoing conflicts, and understand that each of our successes depends on finding a new path of cooperation with our neighbors. India and Pakistan must cooperate. China, Japan, and Korea, despite past historical tensions, are obviously deeply economically integrated and must cooperate. And the list goes on. Wherever there are tensions, I would say the highest economic returns is in overcoming those local divisions so that the great riversheds, the great natural resources, the great renewable energy sources of ESCAP can be tapped cooperatively and peacefully. Second, we need regional cooperation at a larger scale. I'm very gratified, for example, by the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in the East Asia Pacific region. That is a trade arrangement that brings together Japan, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 ASEAN countries. It's a tremendous grouping of about a quarter of the world's population and output that can accelerate dramatically the digital and green revolution. Well, ESCAP is filled with such natural regions in South Asia, in Western Asia, in Central Asia, where regional cooperation can make a profound contribution to green and digital economic development. And knitting this together are large initiatives such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I believe could play a profoundly positive role in spurring a green and digital infrastructure throughout the Eurasian region and even beyond, given the aspirations of the Belt and Road Initiative. Finally, we need global cooperation. This too is perhaps as tricky as the cooperation of neighbors and the cooperation of regions. Because at the global level as well, we have a tendency, a dangerous tendency, for great powers to jockey in competition, to try to make opposing alliances, to make threats and hostile moves, or at least moves that are seen by others as dangerous and threatening. And in today's world, I'm especially worried about the harsh talk, and I believe the completely unnecessary tensions between China and the United States. Two leading countries with fundamentally shared objectives and needs, and we're both working together, could play a profoundly positive role to enable the world to overcome COVID-19 and to move decisively towards a green, sustainable, digital world economy. And yet the talk has been rather tough in recent weeks, and I think for no deep reason other than two large powers eyeing each other warily, and I believe unnecessary provocation, I may say, from the United States side, which I hope we overcome. Because if the two countries work together, and especially if the major powers of the world, the European Union, the United States, China, Japan, Korea, India, the African Union, and others can find a common path to ending the pandemic, to mobilizing the vaccines and the other interventions we need, and to agreeing on the pathway to universal digital and green technological mobilization, the coming years could be not only a rebound from this crisis, but because of the technologies in our hand, could be a wonderful period for advancement of human well-being. We'll have the opportunity to put this to a test soon, and I hope that we work hard for success. We have several key summits coming up later this year. We have the UN Food System Summit and the Sustainable Energy for All Summit at UN headquarters in September at the opening of the UN General Assembly. In October, we have China's hosting of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then, of course, in Glasgow, Scotland, in early November, we open COP26, when all countries of the world, I hope all of ESCAP's members, come forward with commitments and plans to decarbonize and reach climate neutrality by 2050. It's a big agenda for the world. The stakes are extremely high, but the benefits for humanity are even higher. Thank you so much, ESCAP, for your leadership and for this year's wonderful report.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. As always, you mentioned a lot of things that leave us with much to think about and a lot of action ahead for us. Let me now turn to Mr. Hamza Malik. Again, he's the Director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division. He will have a few words about the study, about the survey itself this year. Hamza, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mitch. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for setting the scene. I really appreciate your emphasis on cooperation with neighbors, regions, and globally as well. You couldn't be more right that without cooperation, I don't think so, the world will be able to effectively pursue sustainable development. Thank you, Ibu Armida, for setting the scene as well in laying out the key messages for the audience. What I'll do is, I'm here a representative of a dedicated and a very hardworking team, which is led by Shweta. So Shweta will be speaking in a minute. I'll simply take you through the broad messages and a near-term outlook, and then Shweta will actually take you through the crux, through the core research part of the report. So let's start with the fundamental key messages, broad ones. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first one message is the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 pandemic was amplified due to lack of resilience and investments in people and the planet. This is an area which ESCAP in our research and survey especially have been emphasizing, that the region's policymakers are paying undue attention or too much attention to only economic growth, which is coming at the cost of ignoring investments in people and planet or resilience. And the COVID pandemic has simply amplified several of these existing vulnerabilities, such as lack of investments in social protection, for instance, or health systems. So very first recommendation, the message is policymakers must continue their support in the near term, coming from fiscal side, from monetary measures, whatever it takes. While they're doing that, we're also advising in the survey they need to come up with policy packages, and we share a lot of ideas that can help build resilient economies that are in line with the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now the core, next please. The core of the one core message of the research side of the survey is policymakers tend to work in silos typically. This is an economic shock, and that particular ministry is going to deal with that. This is a health shock, so a different ministry is going to deal with that. What we do is we looked at the last shocks, both economic and non-economic as well, and propose a more integrated risk management approach to policymaking. Once you account for all possible economic and non-economic shocks, and there are benefits to that which can be had. So after building this case, we propose actually a policy package to what we call Build Forward Better. And Ibu Armida also alluded to some of the benefits that will accrue if countries implement such policies. There are essentially three broad areas: investments in social services, digital access, and green development. They'll help build the resilience, and they are consistent with the ambitions of the 2030 Agenda. And Professor Sachs was also emphasizing the importance of digitalization and green development. Now, obviously, as economists, we are very well aware of the implications of implementing such policy packages for the fiscal space and debt and so on and so forth. So we do also explore several fiscal space issues, how countries can build those, and a range of policy options, financing options that they can consider. So let me quickly take you through to the near-term outlook, the present basically, right? So as we always start, the economic outlook. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is pretty much known now, the biggest shock the region has seen or the world has seen. This is the worst economic performance in recent history. As you can see, the economic growth, GDP growth, has been on a declining path for the last few years, but then COVID simply put everything off the charts, and our estimates are showing for 2020, the region may have contracted by about 1%. It's slightly better than what we were expecting earlier, but nonetheless, it's still a contraction, and there's a lot of variation between different countries and different subregions. The consequence of this shock is, of course, both on jobs, for instance, and increases in poverty. So, for instance, 140 million equal number of full-time jobs may have been lost in 2020, and a significant increase in poverty, depending on which metric you use, 89 million according to $90 metric, and even 172 if you use a $5.5 per day metric. So significant socioeconomic impacts. It's a bit too early. There's a lot of uncertainty still around the parameters, such as vaccine being rolled out or not. However, at this point in time, our expectations are the region will see increase in GDP growth in 21 and 22. Primarily, it is what we call base effects, which means the level of activity in 2022 was so low, anything that you have in 21 in growth terms, you see a big number. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows that the impact on the level of economic activity are actually a little more permanent. So at this stage, we're expecting a rebound to about 5.9% in 2021, and then stabilizing around 5%. Next slide, please. So why we are optimistic? Well, some things are already happening. For instance, vaccine rollouts have begun, although a bit unequal, not consistent. Fiscal and monetary policy support has been quite huge, and still we expected that it will remain accommodating for the remainder of 2021. The regional value chains have actually performed really well. That gives us hope and reason for optimism. And major economies globally have begun to gradually recover. And then given that the region is actually quite well integrated with global economies, it might actually take advantage of that. However, overall, the risks are tilted to the downside. As I said, there is still a slow progress and significant uncertainties on vaccination. Within countries and across countries, who's going to do what is the pace, when everybody will be vaccinated, the new strains of COVID coming up, creating challenges and those kind of uncertainties. Trade and services, in particular international tourism, still remains subdued, primarily due to lockdowns and movements across borders. Debt distress is on the rise, which may limit and is already limiting the ability of countries to take forward some expansionary fiscal positions, fiscal stances. So that's the risk we highlight. There already are long-lasting impacts on productivity. There's uncertainty around capital flow movements. We saw a lot of volatility in the early part of the 2020, early part of the pandemic itself. And there are, as Professor Sachs are highlighting, trade tensions, lingering trade tensions, especially between China and US, that are still putting a cloud on the horizon in terms of economic outlook of the region. So what do we do? What are we saying in terms of, this is what I was saying, this is a point that you need to remember, the expected permanent losses and output. So along with downside risk, because this is the path the region would have taken, the blue line, had there no been pandemic. And after the pandemic, we just showed you the numbers, the decline in growth. These are the levels of economic activity for the Asia Pacific region. And our estimate is that the cumulative output loss for 2020, 21, 22 is around $2.6 trillion, right? So that's a risk. So if the economic recovery is delayed further, the risk of these permanent losses are likely to increase significantly in the future. That's something we really need to keep in mind. The other thing we highlight is the quite a high likelihood of what we call K-shaped recovery in the region. And we have highlighted in several of forthcoming ESCAP reports. It's between countries and also within countries as well. So for instance, developed, you can see the comparison between how developed countries have responded and how developing countries are responses. And then we are emphasizing the need for support coming from regional cooperation, from global entities, for developing countries, for countries with special needs in particular, because the gap in their ability to develop or implement vaccines, the fiscal stimulus packages, you can see a huge variation there. The ability to be able to take advantage of the digital technology in terms of access, those kind of things are quite weak in developing countries. So the gap between developing and developed world may actually increase. There's quite a serious risk of that. And I think that's all from my side. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the bottom line. What we are saying is essentially, and reiterating what Professor Sachs was saying, put pandemic control first in terms of near-term priorities. So the remainder of 2021, all eyes should remain on controlling the pandemic, developing vaccines, making sure all the population, all the countries have the access to those. Number two, as the policy packages are being devised, we should make sure these are inclusive. They pay attention to those who are actually not being able to access to the government services. Otherwise, the risks, as we highlight here, are going to be quite high. And there must be continuity of monetary and fiscal support, at least for the rest of the year, if not in 2020 as well. I know there has been calls of some implicit austerity down the line, but it's far too early to call for that. I think right now we should remain focused on what needs to be done, and that is continue the support that is needed, led by the policymakers through fiscal and monetary measures. So this is a near-term dynamics that I just explained. I'll hand over to Shweta to take you through to the research part, where we go in the details of lessons learned from the past and what kind of policy packages we are proposing to build forward better economies. Over to you, Shweta.
Thank you so much, Hamza. So far what we've experienced is an immediate impact of COVID-19, exactly what Hamza has just told us about. However, the region has experienced many more shocks in the past. And there's a famous saying that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So it's a good time to see if we can learn any lessons from the past to build resilience against future shocks. So here you can see the region has experienced various shocks since 1960s. On the left-hand side, you see that the region has managed to reduce the number of financial crises. However, trade shocks, natural disasters, and pandemics have become more frequent. On the right-hand side, when you look at the countries, Bangladesh, Fiji, Iran, the Philippines, and Vietnam are the major victims of these shocks. Now, these shocks are quite malicious as they leave behind long-term scars on the economy as well as on the society and the environment. For instance, investment collapsed after financial crisis and it remained below its pre-crisis level even after 5 years. In the middle graph, you see that inequality as measured by Gini coefficient increased after the last pandemics like SARS and H1N1 and MERS. And environmental performance declined from all these shocks, all types of shocks, including from natural disasters, as you can see on the right-hand side. But the good news is that policy choices can make a difference. So results from past shocks show that counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies, flexible exchange rates, and social protection are very important shock absorbers. External financing such as remittances and ODA mitigate the impact of these shocks on poverty. Diversified economies suffer less environmental damage, but pre-existing structural vulnerabilities can amplify shocks. And here I'll show you actually for pandemic. Consider that case. Even when pandemics had a negative economic and social impact, such impact was more muted in countries that had high level of public spending, less vulnerable employment, and high quality of infrastructure, compared with those that had, of course, a lot of more vulnerabilities like low public health spending, widespread vulnerable employment, and low quality infrastructure. So from these past crises in the region, we can draw 3 lessons. First, countries should do whatever it takes to safeguard sustainable development in times of crisis. Supportive macroeconomic policies and external financing, together with adequate social services, could reduce setbacks in incomes, human capital, and the environment. And what this figure basically shows you is that the potential boost from such policy measures compared to a too little, too late scenario. Second lesson is we need to risk management should be integrated and become a part and parcel of development planning and policy making. Policymakers should put in place effective crisis preparation and coping strategies such as early warning systems and insurance mechanisms. And third, it's crucial to strengthen the resilience of least developed and vulnerable countries, especially when they're compared to OECD countries like these or even other developing countries. Compared to these, least developed countries are lagging behind on almost any indicator that you can think of that captures resilience. So enhancing fiscal space for crisis response and addressing deficits in social and physical infrastructure are key priorities for these countries. So going through a shock right now and learning valuable lessons from the past, I think it puts us in a great stead to build a better future. So far, we've seen, as Hamza had mentioned, the economic recovery remains tentative. And as countries prioritize recovery, they tend to intensify the excessive focus on economic growth, paying little attention to social and environmental issues. But we've also learned from these past adverse shocks that they have reversed development gains that took decades to accomplish. So countries that were better prepared and respond more swiftly and forcefully suffered less from the shocks. And I just want to emphasize that the region was already not on track to fulfill the SDG targets by 2030, even before the pandemic. And given the far-reaching socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19, further delay in reaching the targets is expected unless there is a fundamental change. And available evidence also shows that the region has not fully incorporated social and environmental issues even into the recovery packages. So most recovery policies are not gender sensitive. As you look at the left side picture, out of 441 policy measures introduced in 45 economies, only 57 were gender sensitive. And on the right-hand side, you can see that in many countries, much of the post-pandemic fiscal resources to support energy production and consumption are being channeled to fossil fuels. So, keeping all that we've learned in mind, we propose building forward better policy package that consists of 3 sub-packages. One, social services that enhances access to healthcare and social protection floor. Digital access package, which encourages more ICT investment and more spending on education. And lastly, a green development package that invests in energy access and efficiency, climate resilient infrastructure, and biodiversity preservation. It also suggests canceling fuel subsidies and introducing a carbon tax. Now, when we were analyzing this, we analyzed 2 different spending levels. One, which we call the ambitious level, that means these are the additional investments required to achieve the 2030 agenda. This was something we had calculated already 2 years ago in our survey from 2019. And then there is a business as usual spending level scenario, which requires a certain proportion of this ambitious spending, which is based on countries' past trend of financial resources. So on average, the business as usual spending level is about 40% of the ambitious level. So the building forward package brings several social and economic benefits. These are the results for the ambitious spending, which would yield significant results, decreasing the number of poor by 180 million, as you can see on the top left. It reduces inequality as measured by Gini coefficient on the top right. It also brings environmental benefits, including a reduction in carbon emissions by 30% in the long run, which is on the lower left, and also improves the air quality on the lower right. Now, if you don't invest as much, but you do business as usual, it will still bring some benefits, although they're going to be much smaller than if there were higher spending levels. So for instance, the reduction in number of poor is 55 million as compared to 180 million in the ambitious spending scenario. Well, all these socioeconomic gains are important for a resilient recovery, but this policy package will increase public debt since we assume an increase in government spending is required in order to fight the pandemic and finance the BFP package. So for developing Asia Pacific countries, the government debt ratio is projected to increase from about 50% in 2019 to about 75% in 2030. However, the situation is much worse for least developed countries due to larger spending to deliver such a package. So for them, the debt ratio is expected to more than double from about 35% in 2019 to about 90% in 2030. Now, to build a resilient future, the proposed policies are necessary. But given the buildup of debt, the survey proposes some of the options to finance this debt. So for instance, for least developed countries, the immediate challenge is to pay back debts that are maturing. For this, we encourage countries to engage actively in debt relief initiatives. At the moment, only 10 out of the 24 eligible Asia Pacific countries are participating in this initiative. Among 11 with high debt distress risk, only 6 have participated. So the potential savings from 13 countries that are not participating is about $1.4 billion. And to make that, and they could always go for debt swaps for development, and they can be made more meaningful where creditor countries should grant more generous financing requirements. And in the coming years, governments will face larger fiscal deficits and higher debts, not just to actually finance the current recovery, but also going forward to build a resilient future. So we suggest that least developed countries that tend to have very less developed capital markets, they need to explore the possible use of offshore bonds and diaspora bonds based on the country context. For instance, Thailand lifted restrictions on issuance of unrated foreign bonds in its country so that some of the other countries could raise some funds there. And LDCs should also consider incorporating catastrophic risk into fiscal planning. Now, coming to emerging markets, emerging economies as creditors, they should participate in debt restructuring. Much of the official debt in less developed countries in the region is owed to China. Together, the region could consider creating a regional debt platform that involves all creditors. And to cope with higher debt, effective public debt management is critical. Countries should adopt transparent debt reporting to show commitment to meet debt obligations and learn from best practices, international best practices. In the medium term, countries need to finance ways to finance the SDGs amid tighter fiscal space. So for this, we also in the survey look at emergency financing mechanisms and how we can boost sustainable investing by pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. So sovereign wealth funds, there's an estimate of about $7.6 trillion worth of assets sitting in sovereign wealth funds to support sustainable development and this needs to be channeled into sustainable development goals. So here we need to relax some of the financial some of the investment rules, and financial regulators should agree on common environmental, social, and governance principles and practices in order to encourage more such investments into sustainable development. In fact, the survey's focus on supporting the member states to deal with debt and financing challenges is in line with the UN Secretary's recent initiatives. There have been numerous policy briefs that have been written and high-level events that have been conducted to address these. In fact, just yesterday for us, but still today in New York, earlier on Monday, the Secretary General issued a new policy brief that outlines policy recommendations around 3 areas: immediate liquidity constraints, debt overhangs, and the reform of the international debt architecture. So before I just wrap up, let me repeat that COVID-19 is a unique opportunity to embark on a resilient and sustainable development path. Despite the many uncertainties ahead, this Building Forward by a Better policy package offers tangible policy proposals that can help Asia-Pacific countries to recover from the pandemic and improve their preparedness for the future. Now, as Hamza was mentioning, even despite a very cautiously optimistic outlook, there is a risk of K-shaped recovery. So policymakers should prioritize a recovery that's more inclusive. And policymakers should also assess the wider risk landscape that Asia-Pacific faces, and they should focus both on reducing these setbacks as well as accelerating progress on sustainable development. And of course, let's seize the opportunity afforded by COVID to build forward better. Recovery packages should adequately focus on social services, digital access, and climate action so that we are better prepared for the next shock. So thank you, and I will hand over the floor back to Mitch now.
Thank you very much, Shweta, and thank you also, Hamza, for both of your presentations. We have just about 5 minutes left in our time, as we have perhaps a little bit of time for a question or two. Let me just start with this one to you, Professor Sachs. Very simple question, especially given what the key takeaways that Shweta mentioned there at the end about taking decisions that governments and policymakers must take decisions that take into account a risk landscape. They must be their policies must be much more inclusive, and so on. So here's a very simple question. Do you think Asia-Pacific countries here have learned from their past crises and how to deal with them and how to come back stronger from them?
Let me start by saying that is wonderful analysis that we just heard. Shweta, congratulations on that presentation. And the modeling, I think, is so important to look at the alternative investments, and Hamza also, of course, to look at the alternative investment scenarios, to trace the implications to the bottom line, and with the alternative fiscal implications is exactly the work that should be done. And it addresses your question, Mitch, which is that we need serious analytics, quantified planning. And I think the minimum time horizon for that is not even a 5-year plan, it's a 10-year plan, basically. We need scenarios out to 2030 that take into account the costs of energy transformation, digital inclusion, provision of basic services, and so on, and then to understand our fiscal choices. There's one category of financing that I'd like to add to that long and comprehensive list, and that is scaling up the financing from the multilateral development banks. I would like to see the major multilateral development banks increase significantly their scale of financing, because what they can do, basically leaning on the creditworthiness of the highly creditworthy economies, they can enable lending to the middle income and the poorer countries at low interest rates fixed for long-term periods. So we could have 30-year bonds at 2 or 3% interest rates right now that would make a phenomenal benefit for the kind of fiscal expansion in investment that Hamza and Sweta just talked about. I do believe that this is where our focus of attention should lie, on fiscal management, more tax revenues also over time, global tax reform, taxing the digital sector, and ending a number of tax havens. All of that, it would contribute to the ability to mobilize resources for the sustainable investment strategies that have been just laid out. But I think the analysis is spot on, and I think it gives us some homework to do with each government and regionally to find that needed financing.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question that we received from our viewers on YouTube. It says here that health shocks are on the rise, but there's inadequate global public goods and global regional cooperation of the sort that you mentioned, Professor. Recently, United States officials are talking about guaranteed another pandemic will be coming soon, right? So how can we promote the cooperation needed to ensure that vaccines are developed against these pandemics and that they are promoted as a global public good?
Is that to me or?
Sure, yeah.
I'll say quickly, I don't want to hog the mic, but we need cooperation first on surveillance for early detection. Second, we need cooperation on emergency preparedness to newly emerging diseases. One of the reasons that the East Asia Pacific region did so especially well in this pandemic is the experience of SARS, H1N1, and previous emerging diseases. There was preparedness. Third, we need vaccine capacity and production in each region of the world. We cannot rely only on 3 or 4 main production sites. This is one of the lessons. Otherwise, there's just a scramble for limited resources. So we need to ensure very consciously as we build back that we have a global network of vaccine production and technology capacities distributed throughout the world. This is something that was not present, but is one of the most important lessons of this pandemic.
Thank you. Let me just squeeze in one more question. I think it's an interesting question. Maybe let me give this to Shweta. To what extent do you think are Asia-Pacific countries able to overcome the COVID-19 crisis while shifting to a more inclusive and green development? Do you think economic restoration and a shift to inclusive and green development can go hand in hand? And let me direct this to Shweta.
Myself. Okay. Can you see? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, actually, the analysis just showed that I just showed basically tells you that if we invest in basically social services as well as digital and green development, it's going to have huge benefits, not just social and environmental benefits that I just showed you. Something that I didn't show, which is also in the report, is how much of economic benefits are going to accrue, because potential output is going to go up, unemployment is going to come down significantly, poverty levels I showed you actually are going to come down significantly basically. So we can move towards a more inclusive and green future if we tend to put all these things together. Now, one of the things that we highlighted in the report was about the debt part, but you know what? The debt increase is not going to be much if it's accompanied by some of the measures that can help you get more revenues. Some of the measures actually Professor Sachs already talked about, but one thing that we emphasize a lot in this is eliminating fossil fuel subsidies that tend to be more regressive anyways, and increasing carbon tax, putting a carbon tax in. So those are the other revenue sources that countries can actually harness in order to finance a lot of these investments that are going to be more inclusive and green as well.
Thank you, Sweta. That brings us nicely and neatly to the end of our time this morning. So thank you all, and thank you to all of our speakers, with the Madam Executive Secretary. Most of all, of course, thank you, Professor Sachs. As always, you're a great friend of ESCAP. Very much appreciate always your insights, and to our team of colleagues here from the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division, Hamza and Shweta. Thank you, everybody. We do encourage you all to check out the report itself. The full report is available online. I believe the link is available in on the YouTube invitation. And with that, let me just wrap it up and say once again, thank you all for a very interesting hour, and everybody else have a very nice day.
Thank you.
Sign off.